Okay, can you see my screen? Brilliant, thanks Aidan. And as Aidan said, I'm going to use this opportunity for a short talk about what we've been calling silent earthquakes around the Pacific Rim. So this really comes from, well, I'm going to do a bit of a review, and I'm going to talk a bit about what we found when drilling offshore New Zealand in early 2018. So this is really a lot of this is a multinational effort. But to give you a bit of an outline, what I'm going to do is, although I'm going to focus on this new class of earthquakes referred to as silent earthquakes or slow slip or slow earthquakes, I want to talk a little bit about earthquakes in general first, just to give you a bit of a background. Also, because since I'm sitting here talking to a computer screen, I'm not really knowing my audience. So I'll just make sure we have the background. And then a bit more about what I mean by silent earthquakes and why we care about them, and where we're at with how and why they happen. And a lot of that's going to come from what we've seen from this ship you can see in the background here, the Geodes Resolution, which is at this point parked in Christchurch. So just as a very brief starting point, a lot of studies of earthquakes and plate boundaries come from a background of that. We know rocks can either fracture or flow. So there's a photo on the left there from the Lofoten Islands in northern Norway, where what you see is a long, straight, through-going fracture. It's coated in glass. It's inferred as coming from earthquake slip deep in the earth along that fracture, creating a friction melt that then solidifies. And you can think of that as one end member. So earthquakes forming on pretty planar fractures. And the other end member to the right there is rocks essentially flowing slowly, steadily, under high pressures and temperatures, but deforming very slowly. And at the Earth's surface, you get the effects of that: the fast fractures forming earthquakes, deforming the roads, deforming our infrastructure, and presenting a danger. And similarly, very slow flow, creating very slow deformation, for example, bending fences in California. Now, if we look at earthquakes more broadly, now zooming in on the Pacific Rim, if you plot up all earthquakes in the last 30 days over magnitude 3, you get a map that looks like this. So basically, they don't map on randomly. They follow more or less the coastline around the Pacific. There's lots of them. There's about 100,000 magnitude 3s globally over a year. Even in a month, there's somewhere between 5 and 10,000 globally, and a lot of those are around the Pacific. So the plate boundaries map out as areas of lots of earthquakes. If we think a bit more about size, again, looking around the Pacific, if we talk about big earthquakes, then in instrumental time, so the last 100 years or so, while we've had seismometers around the world, we've had 5 magnitude 9s. 4 of them are around the Pacific, in Chile, Alaska, Russia, and Japan, and then there's a 5th one in Sumatra, so just into the Indian Ocean. So activity pretty much all along the Pacific coast again, and in places forming very large events. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about how those events form, or what kind of environment we're dealing with here, because although earthquakes form in many environments, I'm going to focus on this Pacific coastal setting, or subduction zones, where what we see is the ocean lithosphere, the oceanic plate on this cartoon, being pulled underneath a continent. So the ocean's less buoyant, it's denser, so therefore it goes underneath the continent. And it does so, at an average rate of centimeters to tens of centimeters per year. So a little bit like fingernail growth, so very slowly. But that steady deformation is generally occurring incrementally in earthquakes. So I'm going to start an animation here where you sort of see how that works. The ocean plate is moving to the right. As it does so, it pulls the continent with it. And at some point, that contact breaks, the continent rebounds, referred to as elastic rebound. That happens very quickly, at about 1 meter per second. And then that cycle repeats. And the sort of stresses involved are on the order of millions of Pascal, so they're very large. Now, the way that's seen at the surface, I'm going to play the cartoon again, but now watch this GPS station that's marked on the Earth's surface. So as the continent is pulled to the right here by the ocean, that GPS station moves, and then it flicks back. So at the surface, if this is, say, think of this as South America, then that's an eastward movement of the GPS very slowly, snapping back very quickly. And that's also what we see in the record. So this is an earthquake in Chile. You can see the x-axis here is in seconds. The 3 colors are position of a GPS station relative to a starting point at 0. Red is vertical, green is north-south. But if you look at the blue line, the station is not really moving for the first minute, not so surprising. And then within, from a starting point at 0, by 50 seconds, that station has moved 3 meters negatively to the east, so 3 meters west, as you would have seen in the animation, basically. So that's a normal earthquake. This is a not so normal earthquake. So these sort of measurements have been allowed by recent improvement in GPS technology. And this is a plot from Canada. This is from Vancouver Island. What you're seeing in blue is GPS positions. And it's a similar kind of thing to the previous plot, but note that the scale is now in years. So you're seeing a station moving eastward, very gradually, sort of on the order of millimeters per year, until it bounces back towards the west. And it does that over a couple of months. And then it starts moving east again, does that for a couple of years, or about, actually not quite, it does that for about 14 months. Then it spends about a month, 2 months bouncing back, and then it repeats. Essentially very, very close to periodically. So while earthquakes are hard to predict, these events seem a little bit more predictable. But slip is much slower. So you've got millimeters of slip over a month rather than meters over seconds. The other thing you see here is this black line, which shows activity at about the same time as this slow slip. Those show amount of basically seismic noise. It's referred to on this plot as tremor activity. Tremors in this sense is not the same as earthquakes. It's rather a noisy signal that seismometers pick up. But it's related to these slow slip events. So the slip is slow, but it's accommodated by something that's also creating some noise in seismometers. But basically, you see a very similar kind of slip, but instead of meters per second slip over a minute, the displacement happens over weeks to months. If we map that in space, so basically using these seismic signals to locate the GPS signal, assuming they're coming from the same place, we're now looking at offshore Canada. And you see in map view, the plate boundary intersecting with the sea floor along this red line. There's then an area that is presumed to be locked. So like in the animation, the ocean is, or the oceanic lithosphere is sinking. It's pulling the continent with it down to a depth of about 20 to 30 kilometers. And below that, before year 2000 or so, we thought that the ocean crust was just steadily pulling down. not connected to the continent. But now it seems like these transient events are coming from that sort of depth range. So below this locked zone, it's not actually creeping steadily. It is moving transiently a few centimeters every year or so. Here is a map of New Zealand showing essentially the same thing. It's mapped a little bit differently. In this map, the red is showing where the plate interface is locked, so where the ocean is pulling the continent down. In southern New Zealand, that's a broad zone going down to a depth of about 30 kilometers. So this is an interface, plate boundary, the plate boundary intersects the seafloor at the end of this map, end of this red zone, and then dips down towards the northwest. So further northwest you go, the deeper you get, basically. So this is a broad locked zone, but in the north here, there's basically no locked zone at all. And these blue contours show slip in slow slip events accumulated over many cycles. And I'm going to zoom in on this area, and that's this place. And now I'm only showing one single slow slip event or silent earthquake outlined in red that occurred in 2015 and was mapped out in detail. So we know pretty well which area it covered. It went pretty much all the way to the seafloor. It might have gone all the way to the seafloor. It's a bit of lack of resolution. And then down to a depth of about 12 kilometers. The advantage of this event is that while the Canadian events are at 20, 30 kilometers, so are events offshore Japan, this goes very shallow. Actually, it goes shallow enough so that you can reach it with a borehole. So this area, we know the area here is accommodating slow earthquakes. We don't necessarily know exactly where they are, but we know they happen. And we also know that normal earthquakes happen. So here is a section. Now looking at the same area in section view, the plate boundary reaches the seafloor over here, labeled the formation front. There's a system of faults that then merge at depth. And on this system of shallow faults, there are several little earthquakes that have occurred over the last few years, marked by stars and circles. The stars are where the earthquakes are happening multiple times in the same place. And then slow slip events are happening in the depth range showed by the red line. But they may migrate onto the shallower faults, they may not. There's also been some shallow normal earthquakes creating tsunamis in the same region. What we did in early 2018 was to put a drill hole in here, marked by U1518 fault on this map, which went through one of these shallow faults to basically have a look at faults that happen very shallowly in this region. What do they look like? And you could imagine that this fault that we drilled through would have started as a fault at the deformation front. So it would have at some point likely been the easternmost of these faults. This is just zooming in on it. We can see it clearly in the seismic section. There's a sharp, steep slope where it reaches the surface. That's probably a scarp from a landslide. So as it steepens in fault activity, it gets steeper and then eventually fails. And just to make a point is that the sort of samples we get look like this. They're narrow, they're a few centimeters wide. So it's a very one-dimensional sample. But what you see is sediments that are away from the fault. On this image on the right, you see sediments that are sort of horizontally bedded on top of oceanic seafloor materials. But for the fault zone, that is all in these shallower sediments. These are quite hard to interpret, so there's quite a lot of discussion around these on the ship, as you can see in the photo. But when we looked at them for long enough and come up with a cartoon form map of them, basically what we were seeing was folded sediments above the fault. The fault itself is about 20 meters thick. underlain by some more slightly deformed sheared rocks with some more faults underneath, and then it gets undeformed. So the whole deformed zone is about 60 meters thick. But this more intense 20-meter zone is made of a variety of things, but basically a mix of rocks that look like this. So rocks that are broken apart, fractured into little bits, and rocks that look like this, which looks more like the flowing rocks in my early images. So this fault seems to be a mix, and you can see that in more detail in these images, where you have some sort of sheared folded rocks that are cut by fractures, again here. So while you would expect or often think of a fault as a planar fracture surface, these faults are much more complex than that, and basically contain a mixture of rocks that have seen flow and rocks that have seen fracture. Now, the problem with this set of observations is that they only come from these shallow faults. The second question is what happens further deeper down, which might be happening in rocks that are actually from the more crystalline the basement of the incoming ocean floor. But we could get at that by drilling a second hole, which we got somewhat further offshore. This red point here, labeled as incoming plate, which is the material that's coming in and that you can then trace to be along this red line where the source of slow earthquakes are. So they might propagate up into these faults, but they would be starting somewhere a bit deeper. And that's also more comparable with other places. And if we look at those, this is a busy plot, but what I'm really getting at here is just to show variety in this hole. So what we drilled through was the stuff in green at the bottom, that's volcanics. That's basically material coming out of seafloor underwater volcanoes. On top of that, there are carbonates and muds, shown in various shades of white and yellow. You see that same variety in the pictures on the right. There's some muds, there's some carbonate becoming limestone as it gets more buried, and then various varieties on volcanics, different colors, different levels of cement, different levels of porosity, which is what these graphs show. I'm not going to go into detail of these graphs, but the point I want you to take away is that porosity varies from 10% to 70%. So that's basically little pores here and there to rock that is more air than its actual rock. Seismic velocity varies in a similar way. Seismic velocity is a proxy for strength. So you basically see here that rocks vary from very weak to very strong at a very high frequency. And you can see a similar thing if you plot percentage of clay minerals, which is another proxy for strength. Lots of clay generally means it's weak, little clay means it's stronger. Again, it varies, it's a bit all over the place. So what the point of that is saying that, well, actually, whatever's along this plate boundary is very variable. And you can think of that in the way of that what's coming in is seafloor. It's not flat. It has volcanoes on it. Sometimes they stick up over the sediment. So basically what you've got scraping along the base of your continent is a top of a volcano. Other places, those volcanoes are buried or they're not there at all. What you've got there is whatever the sediments are, which are generally quite weak, clay-rich things. And some places you have more of a mix because the volcanoes only just stick up. Why does this matter? Well, if we take my previous sections and put some colors on them, you can see that if our slow earthquakes start in here, then they're starting from not a single rock type, but they're starting from where you have a mixture of volcanics, carbonates, and muds, all interacting. And they might propagate onto these shallower faults that are in the sediments that we've already seen have deformed by a mixture of fracture and flow. So what we're proposing here is basically that, if you have these varied materials, they're going to act in a varied way. And that might be one way of generating a range from fractures in very hard or intact rock to flow in rocks that prefer to do that to some sort of intermediate. And one way to think about that problem is to finalize here with a final slide on what rocks that have been to depth and been brought back up look like, which is basically some mixture of what I started with. You have this mix of sandstones and muds on the left, which you can see have flow structures and folds in them, but they also have through-going fracture surfaces that are themselves folded. So there's some sort of intermingling. And you could, if you look at the image on the right, which is a combination of basalts, so ocean floor, volcanics, and sediments, you again see that if you're going to start a fracture in here, it might start off in some of these harder materials, but then it's going to make it through the softer stuff. So you can imagine that basically this recently discovered mixture of that rocks don't necessarily just fracture or just flow, they do things in between, really arises from what we see in rocks as a variety of rock types deforming in a variety of ways. So I hope that was of some interest. Certainly something we're spending a lot of time on at the moment. And if anyone has any questions to that, I'm happy to take them.
Thanks, Ake. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them out into the Q&A box. I have a question to get started. Are these slow slip earthquakes unique to the Pacific Rim, and are they unique to subduction zones kind of in general? Or?
Okay, I'm just gonna maybe stop sharing for a second, just go to video for that. They are not unique to subduction zones, or that's by far where we see the most of them. So there's most around the Pacific Rim, which is why we tend to study them there, because the data is that much better. But that is also a function of that most detailed GPS studies are in subduction zones and around the Pacific Rim. The other place where they see a lot of it is in California. The first discovery was there back in the 90s, but that was a once-off event, and it was a bit strange, and data weren't that great. But some parts of California, they see them a lot. But other than that, there's been a few reports in Taiwan, so some like onshore rather than necessarily offshore. There's some suspicions in Italy, but again, the data isn't that great. So there's all the reports so far are on either subduction zones or transform faults. And then there's this possibility on a normal fault in Italy, but maybe not.
Great, thanks.
And they've looked very hard in Turkey and not seen any.
Okay, so can't see any other questions. So a reminder to everyone that next week we've got a talk from Ollie Campbell on the role of structural geology in geoheritage and heritage studies. So that'll be at the same time next week. Using the same link, you can access it through the Facebook page or through the university website. Yeah, I think that's everything. Thank you very much. Okay, that was really interesting.
Right, thanks, Aidan. See you next week.
Okay, cheers.